Anyway, so you might be wondering, well, why would, what is the Stoic conception of nature and why would Kant want to rehabilitate it? So I'm going to start with some background to shed some light on the historical and philosophical interest of those questions. And I'm going to begin with some big picture remarks about Stoics ethics, about Kant's ethics. Now, most people, when they approach Kant, the first thing they read is the groundwork. Maybe they make it to the second critique. And I want to just begin by explaining that these are the groundwork and the second critique, the works of Kant's ethics that he's famous for. They're methodologically distinct from the work I'm going to be focusing on, really the third critique, but also the works that come after the third critique. So what's distinctive about Kant's, like a work like the groundwork or the second critique or even the first critique, is that these are works that argue from the nature of a rational being as such, and only at some subsequent stage in the investigation begin to introduce considerations about the human being. And in ethics, there's this whole other dimension of his ethics developed more in his later period, that it's not exactly that it makes a break from that way of arguing, but it kind of takes the results of the groundwork and the second critique for granted and is sort of taking on a different kind of project, one that's concerned with the human being from beginning to end. So it's not like you start with this abstraction, the rational being as such, and then you sort of fill out this really abstract picture. Instead, you have these other kinds of arguments that are just about the human being from beginning to end. And in this later period of Kant's ethics, we find a certain sort of teleological argument about human development that he gets interested in. So in these contexts, and this is another way in which we can get confused about these later arguments, you see the word good, and you sort of think of it in terms of the groundwork and the second critique. But in these later arguments, the concept good refers to a developmental telos, the completion of our essentially rational nature in a specifically human way. And Kant develops this kind of teleological argument about human development in several places. Two notable examples are the 1784 idea for a universal history with a cosmopolitan aim, and the 1793 religion within the bounds of reason alone. And these teleological arguments presuppose a providential natural teleology that's rooted in the Stoic tradition. So on your handout, you can see this sort of background and evidence of the first proposition of idea for a universal history. It's kind of on the first page of your handout, about halfway down on the left. All natural predispositions of a creature are determined or destined, though German is bestimmt, sometime to develop themselves completely and appropriately. And you could also, that German word is zweckmäßig, proposively is how it's rendered in Cambridge translation. I'll talk more about that word. Moreover, the principle driving the entire argument of idea is openly identified as the teleological conception of nature. So given that you come at this from the, having read the first critique and you're thinking of this mechanistic, broadly Newtonian conception of nature that is familiar from the first critique, you might wonder, how can Kant so blithely take the teleological doctrine of nature as his premise for argument in this later work? It's not even later, it's 1784 or 6, I always get that mixed up, but it's right smack dab in the critical period, actually. As a question about that particular essay, the answer lies in its being Kant's contribution to an ongoing discussion in German Enlightenment circles about die Bestimmung des Menschen, the determination or destination of humankind, or vocation of humankind. And parties to this discussion typically accepted the rational and providential governance of nature, and thus, as a corollary, are being bestimmt, determined in the way we are created to develop to completion. So this kind of starting point for ideas, my point is just nothing, it's nothing weird in the sort of immediate intellectual context in which he's formulating this essay and presenting this essay. So I can talk more about other sort of German rationalists invoking this idea, but I'll just, actually there's a little text box, if you have the handout, sort of on the right, just gives you some evidence of Mendelssohn invoking this kind of idea, but it's not important, we'll skip over that. So Kant's arguments of this kind draw upon and rework canonical Stoic accounts of human development of the sort presented by the character Cato in Book 3 of Cicero's De Finibus, or On Ends. So I'm going to be talking a bit about Kant's relation to these stories about accounts of human development. Now, Stoics suppose that any human being invariably corrupts herself just as soon as she acquires reason, and also that our social situation, the world we create for ourselves and misusing reason and misvaluing, as we inevitably do, makes this corruption endemic. Yet Cato's account of human development and De Finibus, it just entirely brackets that whole set of contributions, that we corrupt ourselves and that we do so inevitably. So he deliberately sets out to tell a story according to natural principles. And by that he means one that traces the human being's development when everything goes exactly as it should. The human being sort of lives in accordance with nature, and you go step by step until you reach virtue, basically. Why does he make that? Why does he just set aside our corruption? Well, that corruption is precisely a perversion of natural principles and thereby can be sort of excluded from the narrative, which is meant to be a kind of normative account. So how does Kant rework that story of human development? Well, basically he says, okay, I take the providential premise, we're endowed with what we need to develop to completion. And there's going to be some developmental story here. But what I do, Immanuel Kant, is I insist that our inevitably self-inflicted corruption be part of that story that we then seek. We nevertheless can see to the end. We can nevertheless see to our developing to completion. What is this completion? This is the idea of our full realization of our essentially rational nature. This is a certain idea of good. So the question, though, when we think about what entitled, like, how does Kant, because I think a lot of commentators, they come to this essay idea for universal history, and they're really puzzled. Like you see this in Martha Nussbaum's essay, Kant and Stoic Cosmopolitanism. She's really puzzled, like, how does he begin with this premise about Stoic providential natural teleology? And, as I said, in the context of that essay, I think he's just kind of talking to his mates. They all kind of accept this. You see this versions of this in a lot of the German rationalists. But what I think that Kant basically does is that he realizes he's got to kind of give an account. He's got to sort of justify this whole conception of nature that's packed into that premise. And where does he do that? Where does he offer that justification in his own terms, in his own work? Well, that's what the third critique is doing. And I don't mean to say that's the only thing the third critique is doing, but I think it's something that you actually can trace it a line through the entire arc of the third critique that's dealing with that question. So in some sense, the whole work is kind of geared up to rehabilitating the Stoic conception of nature. So that's why this is going to be such a big picture talk, because not only do you have Kant big picture, but you also have his relation to Stoics. And so I hope that it's not overwhelming, but so basically what we'll be looking at we'll be looking at things from the introduction to the third critique, and then also some of the details of his account of the judgment of taste. And then I'll say a little bit about the second half of the third critique, the big argument at the end about natural teleology in the second half of the work. Okay, so now I'm moving on to section 2 of the handout, the Stoic conception of nature. And so I'm just going to begin by sort of laying out some of these Stoic ideas that might be less familiar to a circle of people interested in Kant. So nature, according to the Stoic tradition, is rational. This is a quotation from Diogenes Laertius. It's on the handout. Nature is governed by the common law, which is the right reason that pervades all things and is identical with Zeus, who governs the administration of all things. And that's just a very familiar place for this expression of this idea. It's by no means uniquely found there. So the common law of right reason that governs the cosmos is not different in kind from the right reason of the human being who is developed to completion, that is, the rarer than a phoenix, virtuous person or sage. Now, the other thing about the Stoic conception of nature is that the natural teleology in play is comprehensive. So in this respect, the Stoic view has roots in Plato's Timaeus, for example. And it's distinct from the creature-specific natural teleology that we find in Aristotle. So yeah, like Aristotle has a teleological conception of nature, but it's basically focused on, the organization of, this creature or that creature, not about nature as a whole. And the divine administration of the cosmos is also providential. So in this, graceful words of Seneca, letter 121, nature brings forth her offspring, she does not toss them aside. That means first that each creature is equipped with what it needs to develop to completion, to fully realize its nature as a creature of a certain kind. Second, this providential care is not restricted to endowments lodged within the creature's own skin, so to speak. The providential care extends to inter and intra-species relations, and thus the setup of the cosmos as a whole. So everything in nature is for the whole, and indeed, on the Stoic view, the whole cosmos is an ensouled organism, which is kind of a wild view. Okay, so the other thing, when Stoics sort of think about the natural world, they distinguish the parts of nature that possess soul and take these to be the parts of nature that are truly alive. And unlike Aristotle, they don't attribute soul to plants, they attribute soul only to animals. And you'll see Kant speaking of, if you look at the way Kant talks about life, he always talks about life in a way that is attributable just to animals and not to plants. And you see this in Mendelssohn, you see this in all of his circles. So they're all kind of taking aspects of the Stoic conception of nature for granted. So anyway, Stoics take plants to have natures, but to lack soul. For Stoics, soul is connected to life, which they understand in terms of agency. An animal's nature is not completed or fully realized through a mere process of growth. Rather, an animal must do certain things to complete its nature. The animal must act appropriately. And this is lower right-hand corner that's sort of emphasized. We're on still the first page of the handout. You could go up a page, Seniye. No, up, yeah. Yes, okay, so we're still at this bottom right-hand corner of the handout. So an animal must act appropriately, and what is this idea of appropriate action? Well, it's to act in ways that, will promote its development to completion. Sorry about all the noise. So what the word for these appropriate actions is kasekonta in Greek, or officia in Cicero's Latin. And this is actually when Cicero's when his work De Officiis is translated into German in the 18th century, it's translated as, on duties, Pflichten. So there's lots to talk about there, but that's not my topic. Okay, so nature endows animals so they are predisposed to act in the appropriate, which is to say, completion promoting ways. So when we talk about appropriate action, we're just talking about a way of acting that is contributing to the animal's developing to its telos, the full realization of its nature. And nature achieves this. Now we're on top of page 2. Nature achieves this most fundamentally by orienting each animal to its own constitution. So Cicero's Cato, this is in the box there. So Cato is the character in Cicero's De Finibus who presents the Stoic view, and he says, every animal, as soon as it is born, this is where one should start, because the minute it's born, it's no longer, it's like now it can move about on its own. That's when it acquires soul. So every animal, as soon as it is born, is concerned with itself and takes care to preserve itself. It favors its constitution and whatever preserves its constitution, whereas it recoils from its destruction and whatever appears to promote its destruction. And further, Cato explains, this concern is made possible by the animal's sense of itself. Sensum sui is the Latin. So Diogenes Laertius says, reports the exact same view. And again, we can find it in other places, but this idea of an animal has a primary affinity for its own constitution and a certain awareness, fundamental awareness of its own constitution. So this sort of basic self-care is made possible by the animal's awareness of its own constitution. And this awareness is perceptual, a sensus sui, as Cicero puts it. That is, it is a felt self-presentation. There's a felt self-presentation common to all animals, and that is the basis of agency. Further, this sensus sui orients the animal to act appropriately and not, on the Stoic view, pleasure or pain. Seneca illustrates the point with a baby who's trying to stand and repeatedly, he says, falls as soon as it begins to tax its strength. Over and over again, it cries as it gets up again until, despite the pain, it works its way through to what nature asks of it. At the same time, Stoics allow that pleasure may supervene as a byproduct or after effect of appropriate action. And this is a quotation from Diogenes Laertius, that is only after nature has sought and found what is suitable to the animal's constitution. So that little detail there, actually, we're going to be coming back to when we look at the judgment of taste, Kant's account of the judgment of taste. So what I'm summarizing is the Stoic doctrine of oikeiosis. The word's really hard to translate. There's really no perfect one-to-one translation, but it can be rendered variously as appropriation, familiarization, orientation. It may help to note the root of the word in the ancient Greek word for house, oikos. So at its core is the idea that animals are providentially equipped with psychic and somatic predispositions that orient them to act appropriately, as I've said, by engaging affinities, and that's the idea of like familiarity, house, engaging affinities for those actions and things that properly preserve them in their constitution, and abhorrences for those that threaten this. So it's a kind of like, bringing, you're in the world and you bring certain things into the sphere of into your sphere, right? And you shun certain things that are not proper to your sphere. And you do this, you're doing this like, when a spider builds a web, it sees the closest of the branches maybe as kind of like mine, and, works from branch to branch. And so it's acting appropriately, and it's also situating itself in the world as it does this. And when Seneca gives his account of this, it's this curious idea of like an animal perceives its own constitution. He says, well, of course, this isn't like a discursive understanding of its own constitution. It just kind of, the animal has to kind of feel some kind of perceptual awareness of its own constitution, and the constitution can develop over time. It's not like, through different stages of life, but what's constant through all the development is the animal's awareness of its own constitution, this basic sensus sui. Now, I mentioned that Stoic natural teleology is distinctively comprehensive. And so part and parcel of that is a concern with these sort of inter and intraspecies relations which have to do with a creature's situatedness in the world. And so talked a bit about spider there for a second, just off the cuff. There's, Chrysippus is always pointing to this example of a little shrimp that lives inside a Mediterranean bivalve, and they have this kind of symbiotic relationship. And so it's all this sort of ways in which an animal acts appropriately that situates it's how it's situated in the world. And then, particular attention is paid to the cooperative activity of social animals, like bees, and so forth. And then the idea is, bees are congregative by nature. And then Cicero says, we are like this too, obviously. And Cicero's very sanguine about our sort of drive for community. And he says, we are congregative by nature, but we apply our skill and action and deliberation. So we express our togetherness by deliberating together about how to live is the basic idea. So we situate ourselves in the world, sustain human communities by doing things together, determining our common ends, and acting on those commitments together. Human beings are, of course, animals. Thus, the Stoic account of human agency and development belongs to that this whole package that we've been considering. So again, nature looks after our creatures, endowing them with these predispositions that compel appropriate action. But when the human being acquires reason, her actions can no longer be directly compelled by these predispositions. Now she can only act on her own initiative, and indeed she might not act appropriately. So, all the animals are just all the non-rational animals are just acting appropriately, compelled by these predispositions. But, we act on our own initiative, and therefore we might not act appropriately. Hence the Stoic command, live in accordance with nature. And so the canonical Stoic accounts of development, I've noted, trace the progression of one who actually does live in accordance with nature. And in Cato's version, it goes something like this. At a certain stage, a human being comes to appreciate the reasonableness of her own appropriate actions, these efficia fecunda, that is, that their concordance with the rational order of nature, and then develops an affinity for that very concordance. Now she can act in a new way, namely from the recognition that an action according with the rational order of the universe befits her as rational. So it's like you realize that these things that you're doing, these appropriate actions, that's just part of how the rational order of things is set up, and you sort of appreciate that their concordance with the rational order of nature, and now you act from an affinity for that very concordance with the whole law of the universe. Okay, so just want to say a little bit, one more point before we turn to Kant about the Stoic picture. Just that in this context, good, the word good, the way it gets used, is it's not really a narrowly moral conception of good, maybe that we would be expecting coming from Kant. It's good is really when Seneca talks about this, basically good is right reason, right? Which in a human being is possible only with the perfection of our essentially rational natures, that is by becoming virtuous. But it's the whole framework of the account is basically developmental. So nature leads us to virtue, leads us to good, and our self-inflicted corruption is perversion of these healthy starting points with which nature endows us. So we turn away from this telos acting inappropriately or in completion hindering ways. And that is human badness, that we're not developing towards this telos. And Seneca, when he discusses this idea, he observes that there's a qualified sense of good, which is just developmental completion. Like there's a kind of good for wheat, he says, like when the summer sun and the appropriate passage of time and the right amount of rain has brought the grain to complete, to ripeness. And you could say this for any non-rational animals. Well, but where all these creatures are only going to be complete according to their own kind, and this picks up on the sort of story from before, the human being stands to be complete, and this is a quote from Seneca, complete in accordance with the nature of the cosmos, and the nature of the cosmos is rational. So that's what we're like good in an unqualified sense is concordance with the rational nature of the cosmos. Now we see this notion of good in Kant's argument in the religion. So I talked a little bit about how in idea, you have one example of this kind of teleological argument about human development. Well, actually you have another one and much richer and interesting, I think more interesting one, but I don't know, maybe it's not more interesting, but it's fascinating. In Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone, 1793. So after the third critique. And the premise of that entire argument is the original predisposition to good in human nature. And that is not like a narrowly moralistic conception of good. It's presented as a developmental telos. And he says this predisposition is original. It's laid in us in the way we are created. So it's a providential endowment. And if we were, to look into the religion, which is not quite our topic here, we would see the sort of signs of his thinking about the Stoic doctrine of oikeiosis. This original predisposition has these different aspects, but basically it's a readiness to find fitting, the appropriate or completion promoting ways of acting according to our animality, our humanity, and our personality, our status as imputable persons. So, and then as we know, Kant's next point in the religion is that we corrupt this providential endowment. This is radical evil. This is his idea of this inevitable corruption in the course of our development from the first exercise of free choice. We inflict this corruption on ourselves, and that is what keeps corrupting this original predisposition to good. And now we're sort of bound to act in inappropriate or completion hindering ways. And this rot is endemic in human community. So our actions in communities are svekvidrig, inappropriate for our development, rather than svekmässig, appropriate for our development. And so in arguing from this premise, he secures the point that we bring this corruption on ourselves. We're responsible for it. At the same time, the providential premise also secures the point that we are endowed with everything we need to develop to completion. So given the providential premise, our development to good must still be possible, even in the face of our endemic and self-inflicted corruption. So again, the Stoic conception of nature is doing a lot of work for him in the religion, and this, what I'm going to be focusing on here, is kind of how he entitles himself to this providential natural teleology as a premise for these kinds of arguments. And I just want to kind of make a case for why we might think of that as being the task of the third critique. So now we're in section 3 of the handout. And I want to just begin by acknowledging, of course, that the problem that Kant ostensibly sets himself out to address in the third critique doesn't seem to have anything to do with the Stoic conception of nature. So I'm going to talk about sort of the official problem of the third critique, and then I'll sort of show how it links back up to this idea of a rehabilitation of the Stoic conception of nature in the course of the talk. So the official problem concerns the comprehension of philosophy as a system. I'll just refer to it as the official problem. And basically, he's writing this after having done the first and the second critiques, which, the first critique establishes transcendental principles of pure understanding. What are these principles? Well, basically, they tell us what it is to figure in the domain of nature. And the second critique established a transcendental principle of pure rational will, the moral law, which determines what it is to be a person and figure in the domain of freedom. And nature and freedom are ontologically distinct domains, and no insight is possible into the one through the law of the other, and vice versa. As a result, the status of philosophy as a system of rational cognition is in doubt. But the third critique establishes, this is what he's doing, that there is a transcendental principle of the power of judgment, which Kant tells us promises some solution to this problem. So the official problem is backward-looking in as much as it arises in the wake of the first 2 installments of the critical project. But I'm interested in a forward-looking problem, how the third critique rehabilitates the Stoic conception of nature for an argument about human development that Kant revisits 3 years later in Religion. As it turns out, the forward-looking problem cannot be considered in isolation from the official problem, the backward-looking one about philosophy as a system. For the nub of the solution to both lies in Kant's idea that the power of judgment, or Talskraft, gives itself its own constitutive principle. And this principle is identified in both introductions to the third critique as the proposiveness, or as I will sometimes prefer to say, the appropriateness of nature, Zweckmäßigkeit der Natur. So I'll talk more about that principle, but let's consider some key elements of Kant's response to the official problem. First, the power of judgment is not the source of any substantive a priori principle. It's not going to give law to any domain of objects, as the understanding does to the domain of nature, and reason does to the domain of freedom. Kant argues in the third critique introductions that the power of judgment is nevertheless an element of the higher cognitive faculty. This is this idea of, the intellect that he gets from the logic of his day. Like the intellect has these 3 powers. It has reason, understanding, and the power of judgment. So it's an element of this higher cognitive faculty on the same broad terms as the other 2, understanding and reason. That is, as this is quotation from Kant, as ones that contain an autonomy. But the power of judgment, again, it doesn't give law sort of as a basis for an ontological domain. It can only give law to itself with respect to itself. And Kant refers to this as the he autonomy of the power of judgment, using the Greek reflexive pronoun. So the power of judgment gives this principle to itself for its own use. Now, I just want to say a little bit about this idea of the power of judgment being a proper element of the higher cognitive faculty. Kant reminds us of this threefold division of the higher cognitive faculty: reason, understanding, power of judgment. He presents the understanding as the faculty for the cognition of the general, of rules, and consistently speaks of the understanding as the faculty of concepts throughout the third critique. Kant glosses the power of judgment here as the faculty for the subsumption of the particular under the general. In this context, Kant also recognizes a distinction between concepts of nature, which rest on the legislation of the understanding, he says, and concepts of freedom, which rest on the legislation of reason. So understanding and reason are therefore sources of distinctively different kinds of concepts. As a result, one might think that think of judgment as the power to subsume particulars under concepts that are given to it from elsewhere. But if we have that conception of judgment, then we don't have a view of it as a self-standing cognitive faculty, Kant says. So for the power of judgment to be a proper element of the higher cognitive faculty, there must be a concept governing its own exercise that is independent of any furnished to it from understanding or reason. And drawing this inference, Kant identifies the concept. That's the text box on the lower left-hand corner of the handout. Were there then to be a concept or rule arising originally from the power of judgment, it would have to be a concept of things of nature, insofar as nature complies with our power of judgment, and thus of such a property of nature of which one would otherwise make no concept at all, except that its arrangement comply with our faculty to subsume the particular given laws under more general ones that are not yet given. In other words, and here's drum roll, he's naming it, this is the principle of power of judgment. It would have to be the concept of a purposiveness of nature for the sake of our faculty to cognize it. So whatever is characteristic of the power of judgment as a proper element of the higher cognitive faculty must lie in its capacity to judge without being given concepts from elsewhere, which is what he goes on to identify as the reflecting rather than the determining exercise of judgment. And the principle governing such exercise of judgment is identified here as the purposiveness of nature for the sake of our faculty to cognize nature, der Zweckmäßigkeit der Natur. Now, the standard rendering of Zweckmäßigkeit with purposiveness in the English translations gives the term a technical cast that hinders our recognizing a basic point, one that indeed emerges in Kant's introduction of the principle quoted just above. And that's that Zweckmäßigkeit is a perfectly ordinary word for appropriateness. And appropriateness is quite obviously a notion that requires completion. X is appropriate for Y. The principle says that nature is appropriate or suitable for the exercise of our cognitive capacities and judgment. And he repeats the point many times, those remarks on the lower right-hand corner of that page, maybe which I won't bother to read out, but you can look at it. He's just saying it over and over again. This idea is this fitness for our power of judgment. And although it's rarely remarked in commentary, we should notice that a conception of providence lies at the heart of the principle. But the principle says that we are situated in a world we can make sense of, that we are epistemically at home in nature. Indeed, Kant's justification of the principle we're about to see turns on the thought that things could very well have been set up otherwise. That is, that nature might have been inappropriate or zweckwidrig for the exercise of our cognitive capacities. So now we're on to, page 3 of the handout. That's perfect, thank you. So to approach Kant's argument, we must notice that the principle contains a conception of nature that's quite distinct from the one advanced in the first critique, where we're taught to think of nature as the sum total of objects of experience that is formally comprehended, grasped as one whole through the principles of pure understanding. The principles of pure understanding are synthetic a priori propositions. So that means they hold of necessity, they're a priori, and they concern, they're synthetic, they concern objects, so they maintain that nature could not be otherwise. That's what you get from the first critique. You get a view of nature that could not be otherwise. Yet, they prescribe, he says, only laws involved in a nature in general, I'll put this quotation, that is in conformity to all appearances in space and time. And he says, the particular laws of nature cannot be completely derived from these principles, the principles of pure understanding, although they all stand under them. So that was from the section 26 of the Transcendental Introduction. And Kant reminds us of this background in the third critique introductions. The principles, for example, the principles of pure understanding say everything has a cause. But he says in the introduction, the third critique introduction, there are infinitely many ways in which something can be a cause. So we have no insight on the basis of the principles of pure understanding into what unifies all possible material ways of being cause. For all that we know from the third critique, and this is, the one in the text box there, the multiplicity and diversity of empirical laws could be so great that it might be possible for us to connect perceptions to some extent in accordance with particular laws discovered on various occasions into one experience, but never to bring these empirical laws themselves into the unity of kinship and our common principle, if namely, as is quite possible in itself, at least as far as the understanding can make out a priori, the multiplicity and diversity of these laws, along with the natural forms corresponding to them, being infinitely great, were to present to us a raw, chaotic aggregate and not the least trace of system, even though we must presuppose such system in accordance with transcendental laws. I think that's one monster sentence. I don't think there's a break in there. Sorry for the long quotation. So a dystopian possibility is presented. We are situated, this is like, imagine this, right? You're situated in a nature that is not suitable to the appropriate exercise of our cognitive capacities. We reject that dystopian possibility when we presuppose that we must be able to exercise judgment in a way that makes possible the comprehension of nature as a system of empirical laws. But why must such comprehension be possible? It befits us as rational. The systematic comprehension of nature belongs to the developmental telos of an essentially rational animal. So we should begin to ask how any of this might promote the rehabilitation of the Stoic conception of nature. First, the principle, but when I say the principle, I mean the principle of the power of judgment, Çekirdek de nature. This principle invokes a providential natural teleology. The discursive content of the principle is that we're situated in a nature that is appropriate for the exercise and development of our cognitive capacities in a way that promotes their completion. This is a point about providential care, one that concerns not just the endowments within our skin, so to speak, but also how we are situated in the world, a key theme of Stoic natural teleology. The next thing to appreciate is how Kant is specifically invoking the doctrine of oikeiosis, the providential affective orientation that guides appropriate action, promoting developmental completion. The clue here will lie in the recognition that the principle of the power of judgment, the Çekirdek de nature, is primarily manifest in the judgment of taste. Its basis lies in feeling. So Kant's account of the judgment of taste makes this point. Indeed, it's the part of the book that actually shows the power of judgment to have its own autonomous principle, as thus far described. That's how he conceives of what the analytic of the beautiful is doing. It's sort of showing, it's actually showing us that we can, the power of judgment has its own principle that's been laid out in the introduction. So further, the idea that the principle is fundamentally manifest in feeling proves crucial to Kant's rehabilitating the Stoic conception of nature on critically respectable terms. Okay, so that's kind of a looking ahead to where we're going. Okay, so now we're on section 4. And that little quotation, beautiful things show that the human being fits into the world. It's actually from well before this era. It's like, it's pre-critical, but, and it's slightly dogmatically expressed, I think. But it's kind of the spirit of what we're talking about. Okay, so we've been considering Kant's presentation of the principle of the power of judgment in the third critique introductions. And we noted that for this power of judgment to be a proper element of the higher cognitive faculty and have its own principle and so forth, it must have some exercise other than determining particulars under concepts of understanding or reason. And that exercise is reflective judgment, which Kant first presents as the exercise of judgment whereby we arrive at concepts. But there's a mode of reflective judgment that's not oriented towards the acquisition of concepts at all, at least not directly, and that's the aesthetic judgment of reflection, which is chiefly the pure judgment of taste. And the pure judgment of taste is our enjoyment, the mode of our enjoyment of beauty, and paradigmatically for Kant, natural beauty. This judgment involves the understanding, he says, as the mere faculty of concepts in relation with the imagination as the faculty of singular representation, wherein they mutually agree for the advancement of their business, or where they are brought into a mutually sustaining free play, he says, since no determinate concept restricts them to a particular rule of cognition in this judgment. The object that arouses our cognitive capacities in this way is, he says, perceived as a proposive or appropriate merely for the power of judgment. That's a quotation. So the pure judgment of taste paradigmatically appreciates through mere feeling the suitability of certain natural objects, the beautiful ones, for the exercise of our cognitive capacities. Such judgment shows the principle of the power of judgment, as Kant says, This is a quotation that I don't think I managed to squeeze on the handout, but he says, "It is therefore properly only in taste, and indeed with regard to objects in nature, in which alone the power of judgment reveals itself as a faculty that has its own principle, and thereby makes a well-founded claim to a place in the general critique of the higher cognitive faculties." Okay, so the discursive content of that principle is that nature is appropriate for the exercise and development of our cognitive capacities. But here Kant suggests that the principle is fundamentally manifest in the judgment of taste and thus through mere feeling. So my sort of expository aims here, what's labeled 1 and 2 there. 1 is to explain how the Stoic doctrine of oikeiosis bears on Kant's account of the judgment of taste, and 2, to explain how Kant's idea that the principle is fundamentally felt allows him to rework the Stoic background in a critically respectable way. The delicate point in all of this is, of course, that the judgment of taste is disinterested. So it involves no satisfaction in the existence of the beautiful object as something promoting the exercise and development of our cognitive powers. Thus, when Kant recaps the view later in the book, I think this is on the handout, and he points to certain products of nature that contain a form so specifically suited for our power of judgment that they serve, as it were, yes, that's there on the handout, they serve, as it were, gleichsam, to strengthen and entertain the mental powers that are here in play. That qualification, gleichsam, is crucial. For Kant's account, neither involves any assertion that natural beauties actually serve this purpose, nor does it allow that we could be thinking of any such purpose in the judgment of taste itself. We don't have that in mind, in other words. Since the judgment of taste involves no concepts, the beauties we therein appreciate are not represented as ends of nature, he says, as in an objective judgment. So you're not seeing it as something, you're not seeing it as sort of set up according to ends. You're not judging it that way under concepts. The judgment neither claims an internally end-directed setup of the object itself, nor an externally end-directed relation of the object to us, that is, that it exists to promote the exercise and development of our cognitive capacities. Rather, the judgment appreciates the object, he says, quote, only as propulsive or appropriate for the power of representation in a subjective relation. So the meaning of the first phrase in that remark is clear. The judgment appreciates the object's suitability for the power of judgment. That's the propulsive point. The second phrase, in a subjective relation, should then signify something other than the object's suitability for the subject, since that point is already made in the first phrase. We may then infer that the second phrase, that in a subjective relation, signifies that the suitability is appreciated not through an objective determination under concepts, but rather through the resources of mere feeling. Therefore, the judgment of taste appreciates the beautiful thing's suitability for the power of judgment, but without applying any understanding of one's cognitive constitution to the case at hand, wherein one would appreciate it as promoting the exercise and development of one's cognitive capacities. So for this to be possible, we must have some kind of perceptual or felt awareness of our own cognitive constitution and what accords with it, some feeling for this affinity or suitability when it arises. Kant makes this point when he elaborates on the status of the judgment of taste as aesthetic. Its determining ground is not a concept, he says, but a feeling, precisely the feeling of the cognitive capacities in their harmonious play. This feeling of subjective purposiveness without a concept, moreover, is distinct from, but nevertheless necessarily bound up with, the feeling of pleasure distinctive of taste. So I'm going to examine that last point, but I first want to emphasize that Kant's account of taste relies on the idea, I'm just sort of underscoring, that the human being would have some sense of her own cognitive constitution and thereby a kind of felt appreciation for what promotes the appropriate exercise and development of our cognitive capacities. With this in mind, we can make sense of a notable but understudied theme of Kant's account of the judgment of taste. He talks constantly about how the beautiful object, in this enjoyment of the beautiful, the representation of the beautiful object is related entirely to the subject, he says, indeed to its feeling of life. He talks about the appreciation of beauty, he says, brings with it a feeling of the promotion of life, and often talks about the distinctive animation of the cognitive capacities in this judgment. glosses an inner causality, which is purposive in relation to cognition as such. So you see all this idea, it's like kind of promoting the life of the mind. So in Kant's account then, the human being's sense of her own cognitive constitution allows her to appreciate through mere feeling the beautiful objects promoting the exercise and development of cognitive capacities, on which supervenes, as we will see next, the distinctive pleasure of the judgment of taste. So I'm going to talk a bit about section 9 of the Analytic of the Beautiful, which has been very controversial among commentators. So a big debate basically coming from Ginsburg's replies to Paul Guyer on the third critique. So Ginsburg writing in the 90s, Paul Guyer writing in the late 70s. I actually side with Guyer in the end, in some sense. I don't, whatever, I understand it my own way, but the gist of where I end up is basically with Guyer, if anyone's curious. So in section 9 of the Analytic of the Beautiful, Kant raises the question whether, in the judgment of taste, the feeling of pleasure precedes the estimation, beurteilung, of the object, or the latter precedes the former. And he indicates that it's no idle question. Its solution is the key to the critique of taste, but it's also obviously debated. And he offers us a straightforward answer. He says, if the pleasure came before the estimation of the object as having some aesthetic value, this appraisal could only track something sensibly agreeable in the presentation of the object, but then that wouldn't be a pure judgment of taste as he understands it. So the estimation of the object must precede the pleasure in the judgment of taste. So I'm going to unpack what these phrases mean for him. To understand the point of the argument, we need to register its immediate context. It's the final section of the second moment of the Analytic of the Beautiful, which argues for the universal communicability of the judgment of taste. So an ordinary determining object, a determining judgment, lays claim to universal communicability through concepts. So if you say that some X is F, like this is green, anyone who grasps the conditions of greenhood or Fhood can in principle recognize the same for themselves. And if I have reason to trust your judgment, I can take your claim on testimony. But a judgment of taste cannot be accepted on testimony. One wants to submit the object to one's own eyes, Kant says, just as if one's satisfaction depended on sensation. The criterion of a judgment of taste is instead, he says, a feeling of the free play of the powers of representation in a given representation for cognition in general. So the judgment of taste appreciates the object in its suitability for the exercise of our cognitive capacities. That appreciation, I think, is the estimation of the object. One feels oneself in a state befitting one as a cognizer, on which the characteristic pleasure of taste supervenes. As Kant concludes, he says in this passage, this merely subjective aesthetic estimation of the object or of the representation through which the object is given precedes the pleasure in it and is the ground of this pleasure in the harmony of the faculties of cognition. Notice that the estimation of the object is itself said to be aesthetic. A feeling of free play is connected to the apprehension of the object. As an aesthetic estimation, it does not determine the object under a concept of an end. We are, again, not valuing the object as promoting the exercise and development of our cognitive capacities. We just feel this suitability and are thereupon pleased in the manner characteristic of taste. So I'm going to sort of skip over another passage where he seems to be saying something different, but we can talk about that if people want to in Q&A. So I'm just going to now try to make the link to the doctrine of oikeiosis, that Stoic doctrine of oikeiosis, explicit. That doctrine concerns the providentially endowed affective orientation of animals. So let me just recap a couple points. An animal is predisposed by providential endowment to feel affinity for actions and objects that sustain it in its constitution and feel abhorrence for what threatens this. This affective orientation is made possible by the animal's perceptual or felt awareness of its own constitution, a sensus sui. The judgment of taste is an affinity for natural beauty on the same fundamental terms. In the Analytic of the Beautiful, Kant suggests that the basis of the judgment of taste is a feeling of free play, a merely felt appreciation of the object, or strictly speaking, its mere representation, in its suitability or appropriateness for our cognitive constitution. That's the estimation of the object. The distinctive pleasure supervenes on this estimation according to the notorious section 9 of the Analytic. What's distinctive of this pleasure is that it lays claim to universal subjective validity. In spelling this out, Kant draws on the Stoic idea of a perceptual awareness of one's own constitution, a sensus sui, namely the sensus communis on which the judgment of taste is grounded. So that's coming up here, and then he revisits that topic in section 40 of the third critique. So let us consider the significance of Kant's point that the principle of the purposiveness of nature is primordially manifest in feeling, that is, in the judgment of taste. We're not judging that nature really is for us, but merely feeling its appropriateness in an orchiosis style affinity for beauty. These beauties are emblems of nature's appropriateness for activity that sustains us, as it were, in our cognitive constitution as rational beings. The principle both emerges and is defended from the subjective perspective of agency, specifically the agency of judgment. Now, the 2 points I want to make about that. First, we see here how the argument of the third critique is fundamentally different from the arguments of the first 2 critiques. It is about the human being from beginning to end. It proceeds in this way because it is not in the business of establishing the foundations of any metaphysics and thus any laws of a domain of objects, of nature, or of freedom. To carry out this kind of work, the first 2 critiques have to rely on claims about what must necessarily be the case for any intellect as such, and each in its own way only subsequently incorporates contingent facts about the human being into the account. But the third critique is not occupied with such a task, and this bears on the justification of the principle, the Zweckmäßigkeit der Natur, which brings me to my second point. The justification of this principle is itself teleological. We presuppose the appropriateness of nature for our cognitive capacities from the first-person perspective of our cognitive agency. We are entitled to this presupposition on the grounds of its being a condition of the possibility of our engaging in the kinds of activities that promote the development of our cognitive capacities to the telos that befits us as rational, which Kant indicates is comprehension. So for reasons of time, I just have to set aside Kant's conception of comprehension, but again, happy to discuss it if there's interest. But that's kind of like where everything's kind of headed, you know, the highest expression of our intellect lies in comprehension. Okay, so now I'm finally on part 5, and I'm gonna sort of wind down, but the winding down is gonna be sort of just drawing this really big picture. So this will be very schematic, but just want to say something about the long arc of Kant's argument in the third critique. So I've been making a case, a very partial one in the interest of time, that the content of the principle of the power of judgment is drawn from the Stoic conception of nature. And so I'd like to return briefly to a detail of Kant's presentation of this principle in the published introduction. For it can seem as if the official problem of the work is just a certain fastidiousness about systematicity in philosophy. And we might sort of think, like, well, who cares, you know, just let practical philosophy be over here and let theoretical philosophy be over there, and just who cares, you know. So it can just seem like Kant's just being fussy. But I think the official problem is richer and more substantive than this characterization lets on. And so I'm going to tease out this point to sort of help bring my account full circle. So in the introduction, Kant speaks of, and this is on the handout there, of an incalculable gulf fixed between the domains of nature and freedom, which leaves us with a problem of understanding how the concept of freedom should make the end that is imposed by its laws real in the sensible world. And some commentators understand the problem to be one of understanding, they take it to be a problem of understanding how the causality of freedom shows up in and can make a difference in the domain of nature. For example, Pauline Kleingeld in a paper from 1998. And of course, there's something incomprehensible for us about how the causality of freedom impacts the causal order of material nature. We can have no insight into the unity of these two domains under some higher principle. We can never give an account of how freedom, produces sensible change in the world, but not a mechanistic causal account. That's not the problem here, though. For the efficacy of freedom must simply be presupposed within human action, right? I can only act on the idea of my own freedom. Kant points to a different problem here. The problem is this: we need to adduce grounds to suppose that the final end imposed by the law of freedom, the moral law, can be realized in nature. Thus, he says in this context that nature, quote, nature must be able to be conceived in such a way, this is his words, that the end determined through the moral law may be grasped as realizable in the sensible world, in nature. Ultimately, this end is not, or not merely, virtue as it might be brought about through the efforts of an individual, but rather consists in what Kant comes to conceive into religion as the ethical commonwealth, a social order, the highest good to be brought about through human effort. So what I want to sketch in parting is just how that long arc of Kant's argument in the third critique sets him up sets him up for that sort of ensuing argument in the religion. So this is the second half of the critique of judgment. It's called the critique of teleological judgment, and it concerns the comprehension of nature as a system of ends. And so just very schematically, the argument, the sort of long arc of this argument, which happens sort of 6 steps there at the bottom of the handout, goes like this. Kant begins by flagging that a certain sort of natural entity presents itself as organized according to ends. We can call these entities organisms. It's not actually a word that he uses. We non-arbitrarily regard such entities as products of art. Like when we look at them and we sort of try to understand them, we sort of think about them as organized. And so if we think about them as organized, we think of them as the product of art, of ingenuity, you could say. Kant then explains that what distinguishes natural organisms from functional artifacts, because lots of things are set up in that kind of way, but what distinguishes a natural organism from a functional artifact is that organisms are both cause and effect of themselves. As a result, their existence cannot be explained on mechanical causal principles, but only on teleological causal principles. So we take these organisms to exist, but once as ends of nature. But once we take organisms to exist as ends of nature, as brought about by nature, acting according to ends, then we think not merely of a possible end governing the constitution of a given organism. So we get beyond that Aristotelian creature-specific natural teleology. So we don't think merely of that internal teleological constitution of a given organism, but also, he says, of the final end, scopos, of nature, which requires the relation of nature to something supersensible. For we are then thinking of nature as acting according to rational principles, and thus answering to standards of practical consistency and coherence. Thus, if there are non-arbitrary grounds to judge certain things to exist as ends of nature, then the same grounds underwrite a globally comprehensive natural teleology. Hence, we must consider the final end of nature and ask, what is it all for? And Kant answers that nature is for the human being as the only rational being on earth. It's a quotation. The Stoics also reached this result, but Kant presses on to a different conclusion. Nature cannot be comprehended as a system of ends if we suppose that it exists for the human being as another natural entity, says Kant. Nature must be for the human being in his supersensible vocation as an essentially rational animal. The solution to the founding problem about philosophy as a system emerges from this argument, which proceeds from the principle of the purposiveness of nature. This solution could not consist in any unification of the domains of nature and freedom under a common principle. Nature and freedom can only remain ontologically distinct, and that's just absolute bedrock in Kant's system. Rather, the solution must come from the autonomy of the power of judgment expressed in the principle of the purposiveness of nature. Proceeding from this principle, Kant adduces grounds to suppose that the ultimate end of freedom can be realized through human action in nature. The upshot of a long argument, in other words, is that nature as a whole exists for this end. We are not just situated in a nature that is amenable to the exercise and development of our cognitive capacities towards the telos of comprehension. We are situated in a nature that is suitable, zweckmäßig, for our higher moral determination, or Bestimmung, to bring about a social order in which the human being may develop to completion. That end is the ethical commonwealth that Kant and the religion deems a duty of the species to establish here on earth. If this is right, then the grand arc of Kant's argument in the third critique is not aimed to assuage a particular fastidiousness about philosophical systematicity, but rather to prepare the way for later arguments about human progress. So I'll end there. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lisa. I mean, it was really wonderful. I'm not just saying to say it, because these are the issues you may remember I am also very much interested in. And I think I have kind of some comments and some questions for clarification, but as the moderator, maybe I should wait for the person to speak last. But thank you so much. I learned a lot, and it also helped me to settle several issues I had in my mind personally. So thank you. I enjoyed a lot. Let's start with the Q&A session. And I think, Seniye, you're the first to go. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. This was a fascinating talk. I am working on the third critique, and I also think that oikiosis plays a very important role there. In fact, I had a paper just came out in relation to that. But I also talk about Epicurus, because Kant refers to Epicurus in the third critique. It seems like he also assumes some Epicurean conception of pleasure as an indication of well-being of the organism. But my question, I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said, but my questions will be, I will invite you to clarify certain things. So first of all, at least in the paper, it wasn't clear whether you want to make a distinction between the feeling of life and the feeling of promotion of life, or do you take them to be synonymous? And in what respect you think that they are different? It seems like they are different to me, but what do you think? And another question is about the developmental account of good. So I find it interesting, but also somehow puzzling to think of Kant would have a developmental account of good, because we would think that the good is determined by the moral law and that it is there. And so we can approach it, but the telos, or the good, it seems like they are kind of a bit different. So let me put it this way. It seems like for Kant, the good is acting rationally, acting according to the moral law, which tells us to act according to certain maxims and blah, blah, blah. So it seems like there's nothing developmental there that's determined by the law. But when I think about how this law applies to me and I say, well, I have to always act according to this law, this means that I have to have a complete holy soul in which all of my actions are in conformity with this law. So the complete conformity of my will to this law is the telos that the law determines for me. And then, the telos is already determined by the law and nothing else. The good is determined by the law and nothing else. And how I can actually, approach this telos, that story seems to be developmental. I agree, because, I learn to be better and better. So I wonder whether you want to maybe say that rather than he has a developmental account of the good, he has a developmental account of how we approach to the good determined by the law.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Go on.
And one last question about the. So I liked your use of appropriateness for this, to translate zweckmäßigkeit, and I like to use it as well. I sometimes use suitability as well. you mentioned some kind of an ontological distinction there, and between realm of freedom and realm of nature, and the ontological came up a few times. Mm-hmm. And as someone who reads Kant's transcendental idealism as making more of an epistemological distinction rather than an ontological distinction, I am kind of, don't know what to make of this. So maybe, do you have this ontological reading of the transcendental idealism as opposed to epistemological? That's the question. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's wonderful to hear about your work, and I'd like to learn more about it. So I'm glad there's other people out here who are sort of thinking along these lines. And I should say it wasn't, there's a precursor for a lot of what I'm doing in the work of Reinhard Brandt. He has a paper on orgiosis in connection with third critique. So, okay, feeling of life and feeling of promotion of life, I guess I've never even thought that they could be distinct. I just took them to be the same. How do you understand the difference between them? I'm curious.
So I take that life for Kant is the activity. And so the activity of our mental state. And so the feeling of that feeling of life is the sensible awareness of our mental activity. So when we become sensibly aware when there is kind of a harmony or disharmony between our cognitive faculties. But then the promotion of feeling of life, it seems like certain representations promote this harmonious relationship. And so they kind of tell me that, oh, well, this beautiful flower is promoting this activity or harmonious activity, but this ugly beetle is inhibiting the activity. Yeah. And so I am becoming, in a sense, promotion is kind of, to me, correlated with feeling of kind of a pleasurable feeling of this harmonious activity versus feeling of life is just neutral.
I see.
Would you agree with that?
I'll have to think about all that, because so little has really been written about this. There's a few papers out recently, but that seems plausible. I'd have to look at the places where the phrase comes up. Because certainly in the case of the judgment of taste, I think what's happening is like yes, there's this free play, but this is itself kind of life promoting, and you're enjoying it, the enjoyment's bound up with that. So I'm not, I guess in the end of the day, I'm not sure how well you can really tease those apart, at least in this context, but I will certainly go back and revisit the text. Now, on the idea of, I think about the developmental conception of the good, I just feel the need to really, I think so many people read like the religion and they're just importing all of this stuff from the earlier works. And they just don't even, it's like they'll be like, oh yeah, they'll just assume that it's all about morality in this kind of really narrow conception of morality. And the way he's using the term good in that phrase, original presupposition good, is just sort of straight out of Seneca, letter 124. So now maybe I shouldn't say developmental conception of the good, because that makes it sound like it all comes down to a matter of a developmental telos. And I'm kind of overstating the point just because I feel like so many people just don't even see it, the kind of thing I want to say. So I think I can be more precise there. Because certainly I agree with what I basically agree with everything you're saying about, for Kant, the good is acting rationally. And so what this, complete conformity of my will with the law is the telos that all this is headed towards. I think that's right. I just think that it's just like in the context of these later arguments, it's just all about the human being. And it's not about this abstraction from which you get the idea of a good will as such. And then you kind of like add these thoughts about the human being. So it's like a very different use of the concept of good that's connected to this, providential natural teleology. And that's, we don't see in the earlier work, but maybe conception of the good is a misleading way to put that. And what was the third? Oh, the ontological stuff. Yeah. Interpretations of transcendental idealism. This all gives me a huge headache, I have to confess. but I mean, I think very clearly when he's starting, the beginning of the third critique, he's very clearly sort of saying, okay, we have the domain of nature and we have the domain of freedom, and we have this problem of like, how is philosophy going to be a system? So whether or not that kind of comes down to like a sort of epistemological two worlds reading of transcendental idealism versus a metaphysical one, how all that's connected. I think at the very least, certainly there's as human beings are animals that are also persons, and that places us in these two. We are in these two domains as a result. And that's kind of the thing that it's just so distinctive of Kant that in a way, all of his thought comes back to.
Right.
So
it seems like you don't have to commit to that ontological reading necessarily, because you can think of the phenomenal world, the world of experiences, and noumenal world, the world of thoughts, but the things that it seems like we are not able to experience in this world, but not necessarily an ontologically distinct world or order. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just that, yeah. But I mean, okay. I'll think about it more. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have another raised hand.
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Everything was good. Thank you very much. Your kind invitation. I have to quit now because I have a lot of to do. So only I have a suggestion, a modest suggestion, not for the presenter, but for your team, okay? I have a natural lawyer, okay? Because I am a lawyer, I'm a jurist. So I suggest that maybe you organize a meeting about, or a session about Stoicism, Kant, and natural law tradition, if possible. Okay, only a suggestion and modest. Okay, please think about it and take care, all of. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure for me. It was a pleasure for me.
Thank
Join
you.
us.
Bye-bye.
You are welcome.
Okay. My question is kind of a clarification. Actually, in the last part, you said a lot about this direction, but I think maybe I would like you to emphasize it more. That's the vision that we all know about, that the task of the first critique, the task of the second critique, and the task of the third critique. And the people who work on Kant's moral philosophy just focusing on groundwork and the second critique, and they take it that's the official Kant's moral philosophy, and not many people check the third critique as the substantial part of the overall moral philosophy. So therefore, we have this mainstream and even sometimes caricaturized Kantian moral idea that we are kind of moral schizophrenics, that we are divided into our rational self and our empirical self. But actually, when we just look at for Kant's moral philosophy to the groundwork and the second critique, it's it is kind of possible to think of such a moral philosophy where Kant himself talks like our true nature is our rationality, our true self is the moral law, etc., etc. But I want to raise the problem that when we stick with this, even several issues that he raises in the groundwork and the second critique are not settled. Likewise, that's the highest good itself or the moral argument itself, they're not settled, and they're therefore are considered kind of some errors, some mistakes, some periphery issues that could be taken out of Kant's official moral philosophy to make it consistent. So I want to shift your title of the talk. That is, you're talking about nature, I know, but we have this problem about human nature, and Kant himself does not really address openly. But when he talks about human beings, our true self is the rational self. But as you suggested, what also I am very much impressed in the third critique is that he says explicitly, when he talks about beauty, it's not even for spirits, it's not for angels, it's only for us. I mean, moral law is for all rational beings, God, angels, they all, are about to the, audience. But when it comes to experiencing the world, it's us, only us. And, this is the tricky thing that, so thinking about the distinction between moral theory which is formal, abstract, but still taken as the official moral philosophy. But we have the idea, we cannot, I think, disregard moral experience, moral agency, or robust moral agency, moral health, maybe. We seem to necessarily address the third critic. So do you think that, because even the very phrase Kant uses when he talks about needs of reason, inclinations of reasons, right? Do you think that these are also relevant to a more comprehensive and more unified sense of human nature that this project of yours also could address? When we talk about human nature per se, does this Stoic perception also could underlie such a more unified human nature in the, critical line still Kant himself draws? So
let me just make sure I understand. So you're sort of talking about you're asking if I think the third critique is playing a role in kind of developing his conception of human nature in an ethical framework. Is that?
But actually, yeah. The one thing is this also, it's also relevant to the question that third critique plays a kind of necessary role to unify the moral philosophy itself, plus because moral philosophy also addressing human beings, if we take it like that. So it also says, as you suggested, something in the direction that a new conception or unified conception of human nature possible as a moral agent by reading the third critique.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, going back to just like the way I started in the beginning, but in the stuff from the introduction, where where he's setting out the whole problem of the third critique, and that like nature, this whole sort of dystopian possibility that comes up. Nature could be just incomprehensible, and the thing that this sort of what he's. And this is not a theme I was able to bring out here, but this theme running through the third critique about wonder, like Bewunderung of nature, that like these moments of wonder where there's a kind of glimpse of this this sort of comprehensibility of nature. And what's kind of like really poignant, I think, is that he really emphasizes the sort of incomprehensibility that things could be like this. And it's kind of like, it's not that it's, in other words, it's like this expression of like, for all the contingency that it's all like this, like for all we can grasp, it's just contingent that this is not something that the first critique principles can tell us about. We appreciate it just through feeling, through the judgment of taste. And the first critique, which is telling us what must hold for any nature as such, can't get here. And so this is the whole theme of the way contingency comes up is very much this kind of, it's like by our lights contingent, and that's what makes him different from the German rationalists who are going to be like, oh well, it's all necessary, and we can know that, and that sort of expression, that's like it's how he's developing this kind of in this space, and why it's a critical rehabilitation. These ideas of humility and recognition of human finitude. But yet sort of in the framework of these pictures, of these ideas. So I think it's very, I think that as for ethics, I think it's really important just to understand that in these sort of canonical critical works, he's got this job, which is like, I got to get law, and I'm only going to get law if I abstract from everything about the human being. It's got to hold for a rational being as such. So, you're going to get the categories from the pure forms of thought, which are coming from pure general logic, and you get this sort of more mysterious, okay, where exactly the world all come from? But it's sort of like, just got to be a law, just got to be a law, and maybe you could look at course card there, but whatever. It's like, but it's just sort of the law of a rational will as such, and that's the only way he's going to get necessity. And then the way I just see it is that you get to these later arguments. It's like, okay, that work's done. But now I need to understand the human being. And he's constantly astonished by the human being, by the rational, natural being. Like this is kind of a continual, and he thinks it's right to be astonished that there could be a creature that could be so moved to act in such a way that could bring its own death, because it realizes the wrong, it would be wrong to do otherwise. And this is a kind of constant source of wonder, and I think that's really important. And that's about us. That's about the human being, and that's why these stories in the religion, the thing in the religion is really important, because it's like, trying to sort of explain how our radical evil can be understood as a species characteristic, but yet it's not laid in us in the way we are created. We bring it upon ourselves, and we remain, it's a comprehensive corruption, but we remain equipped to overcome it. And like so it's not, all the people who think there's got to be a transcendental deduction of radical evil are completely wrong. It's not necessary. We can and ought to overcome it, is his idea. And it really pushes him at the limits of his thought in really fascinating ways. But I think he's just very much, that's what the whole later ethics, later works are about. And you can't really separate ethics from the other stuff in the like post 1790 onwards. It's all kind of together.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So I knew that you would say this, but I really wanted to hear that you emphasize this more for the rest of us. So, but also to add this tiny little part about the human nature itself. So, but still, you don't think that it brings a more substantial revision of Kant's idea of human nature in that sense, then? Because still we keep with the idea that our true, because I think this is also relevant to Seniye's question, because when we say reason with capital letter, it sounds like as if it is abstracted from what is empirical, so what we understand through nature as empirical. But here you're taking nature some line where it is more also, unified with the idea of logos. So nature is a unified that reason is not abstracted from it as the rational principle, but it is also embedded. But in your reading, I think it's through the reflective reading of nature that we find it's not the problem of gulf is in there, but we find that we can be virtuous and we can create a commonwealth, because what nature we are talking about is not a total alien to that idea of reason that we are moved to act by, right? So
and this is why the Stoics are very natural for him to be thinking about here, because I mean, it's very like, so like the Stoic, the thing, and the common law is the right reason that governs the universe, and is identified with Zeus, and like, so like Zeus, very
But Kant is excluding all these, that Leibnizian idea of preordained destiny and harmony. But this is maybe this is why that's
because
welcomes them back from the back door or something like that, because he's not starting with these principles. So the critically and introducing and establishing them, I think, in a critical sense then, right?
Yeah, and it's very important to his whole idea of human development. Like, it hangs in the balance. Like, we're screwing things up pretty bad, and we could keep doing that, but I'm here to show you that things can turn out well in the end. We have what we need. We can do it. So, but no, it's not destined like how it's all going to go.
Please go ahead, Seniye.
So, I mean, I also wanted to say that I'm very sympathetic to your final point about the significance of, the moral aspect of the third critique, because there are cognitive and epistemic readings of the third critique that focus merely on the, on the theoretical aspect, and I agree that there's the moral aspect. And in fact, it seems like the term oikiosis here would help you further, because it's a kind of a developmental way of expanding circles, right? I become first aware of my body, and then my family, relatives, and the humanity, and the whole universe. Ultimately, that feel that I am in home, and that also not as a member, but also there's kind of an ownership built into that.
And the care.
Care, exactly. So I mean, I'm very sympathetic. Okay.
Chapter 7, that's where my book ends.
Yeah. I look forward to reading it.
Yeah, we all. Yeah, we all. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your discussion. That really helped me.
Yeah, okay. I think we don't have any more questions, but once again, Lisa, it was a real pleasure for us. And thanks for sparing this Sunday evening for us. Hoping to see you on some other occasion.
Yeah, it's great to see you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for attending.
Thank you.